Buckle up, everyone, because today we're going deep on a case that's got all the makings of a classic serial killer profile. We're heading up north to Anchorage, Alaska.
Mhm.
Back in the 70s, it was a real boom town back then, thanks to the Trans-Alaska Pipeline. But like a lot of places that grow that fast, Anchorage had a darker side too. And to really get a feel for this case, we've got police reports, court transcripts, even some excerpts from a true crime book called Fair Game. We're going to try to piece it all together and see how what seemed like random events at the time actually revealed a really disturbing pattern.
You hit the nail on the head with that boomtown thing. When a city grows that quickly, you tend to see, an increase in crime. And Anchorage was no exception, especially in the Tenderloin district. It was like a magnet for people looking for opportunity, and unfortunately also for those who were vulnerable, especially women.
Yeah, and that's what makes this deep dive even more important. It's not just about catching the bad guy. It's about understanding a system that may have failed to protect these women. Looking back, it's all those missed opportunities that really make you wonder, what if things had been different?
Right. Like, take the case of Fiona Kennedy in 1971. She was only 18, and she had this terrifying encounter with a man who tried to abduct her at gunpoint. We're going to call him Robert for now. But the crazy thing is, she actually identified him in a police car.
You'd think that would be it, right?
Yeah.
Open and shut case.
You'd think so, but he was released on bail, and get this, just weeks later, he strikes again. This time, it's Gemma Gibbs. He abducts her and assaults her.
It was just heartbreaking.
Yeah, and Gemma, she actually managed to talk him down by promising to stay silent.
Wow.
But that decision really haunted her later on,
I can't even imagine.
especially when another woman, Beth Van Zanten, was found murdered. Gemma was just racked with guilt, thinking maybe if she'd spoken up, things might have been different.
It's that ripple effect, how these crimes impact so many lives beyond the immediate victim.
Exactly. And Beth's case unfortunately remained unsolved, but there were some similarities to the attacks on Fiona and Gemma. Similarities that suggest Robert might have been involved, even though he was already known to the police.
So many what ifs. It really makes you think about how these events could have been prevented.
Right. Could there have been earlier intervention? Were there missed opportunities to hold Robert accountable? These sources really dig into those tough questions.
Okay, so we've got Robert on the radar of the police. But fast forward to the late 1970s. He's out on parole after serving a short sentence. And guess what? He's still targeting women.
It's like a broken record, but
Yeah.
even worse this time, the violence escalates.
What happened?
Well, there was an attack on a dancer from the Kit Kat Club, and even his parole officer was noticing some really troubling behavior. But without the victim's cooperation, the case stalled. And then there was Judy Russell. She was a dancer from the Embers Club, and she actually managed to escape from his truck.
Seriously. That's incredible, considering what we know now about how dangerous this guy was.
It really is. But unfortunately, it seems like after Judy's escape, Robert shifted his focus to even more vulnerable women.
You're talking about the women in Anchorage's Tenderloin district.
Exactly. The sources paint a picture of a lot of these women struggling, maybe new to town, looking for work, and that made them easy targets for someone like Robert.
So many names come up. Roxanne, Elan, Lisa Frell, Malay Len.
All young women who went missing.
And it seems like a lot of them were last seen with men who were offering them money or work.
It was a pattern.
And the saddest part is that a lot of these cases were dismissed by law enforcement. They just assumed these women moved on. But their loved ones knew better.
It's heartbreaking to read their accounts, knowing that these disappearances weren't taken seriously enough at the time.
Right. But then in 1982, everything changes.
Yeah, two off-duty police officers are out hunting in the Nick River Valley, and they stumble upon something horrifying.
What did they find?
A meticulously buried body.
Oh my God.
It was Sher Morrow.
Then how did she die?
She'd been shot with a high-powered rifle.
That's chilling.
It definitely wasn't just a random act of violence. The remote location, the burial, this pointed to something much more calculated and organized.
Oh, they're thinking serial killer now.
Yeah, and it gets even more eerie. The bullet that killed Sher was a match to another victim, Paula Ging. Her body was found a year later in the same area.
Wow. So 2 victims linked by ballistics.
And if we add to that the earlier discovery of Klutner Annie, she was found stabbed in a shallow grave. It all starts to paint a really grim picture.
Like a horrifying puzzle coming together.
A serial killer who'd been operating undetected for years.
And I'm guessing that's when the authorities really started to ramp up the investigation.
Exactly. Sergeant Glenn Floyd knew they needed help, so he reaches out to the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit.
Okay, so now the big guns are involved.
Right. And they send Agent Roy Hazelwood. He was a pioneer in understanding serial killers.
So what did Hazelwood make of all this?
Well, he came up with a profile that was pretty insightful. He didn't just focus on physical attributes. He delved into the psychology of this killer.
So what kind of person did he think they were looking for?
He predicted an age range, a possible criminal history, even personality traits. Intelligent, probably respectable on the surface, but with a dark side lurking underneath.
And was he able to connect any of this to the crimes themselves?
Absolutely. He zeroed in on something that was key to the whole case: hunting.
Hunting.
Yeah, remember the remote locations, the way the killings were becoming more methodical? It all mirrored the patterns of a hunter stalking prey.
That's a chilling connection.
It is. It wasn't just random violence. There was a disturbing ritualistic element to these crimes.
So they had a profile and they had a possible motive.
Yeah.
But were there any leads?
Well, that's where things take another twist.
What do you mean?
Sergeant Floyd came across a report that was pretty unsettling.
What kind of report?
It was about a truck driver who encountered a woman near Merrill Field.
What was so strange about that?
She was handcuffed and screaming for help.
Oh my God.
Yeah, and the details were really disturbing. She was barefoot and clearly terrified.
That's scary.
And the timing of this encounter was significant. June of 1983, just months before Paula Ging's body was discovered.
So this woman could have been another victim?
Possibly. Or maybe a witness who narrowly escaped.
So many questions.
Right. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. This deep dive is far from over.
Yeah, we've got a lot more ground to cover. Stay tuned.
Yeah, that report about the woman near Merrill Field, it just adds another layer to this whole thing. Like, maybe the killer was getting bolder, striking closer to the city.
And you were talking about how Agent Hazelwood's profile mentioned a hunter.
Yeah.
Was there anyone in Anchorage who fit that description?
Oh, yeah. There was this guy, Robert Hansen. He was a baker.
Baker.
Yeah, a family man, well respected in the community. But as you dig into the sources, you start to see this really dark side emerge.
It's almost like a Jekyll and Hyde situation.
Yeah.
How could someone compartmentalize like that?
It's a question that's fascinated a lot of people, especially criminal psychologists. I mean, the sources don't really offer a clear-cut answer, but they do show that Hansen was a deeply troubled individual, lots of rage and resentment, and he had this obsession with hunting. But it wasn't just any kind of hunting. He was fixated on the thrill of the chase, the power dynamic between predator and prey.
And that spilled over into his real life.
Tragically.
The sources really highlight how calculated these attacks were.
Right.
He would abduct women, often from the Tenderloin district,
Yeah.
and then fly them out to the Alaskan wilderness in his private plane
It's like something out of a nightmare.
to be taken to such a remote and unforgiving place.
Exactly. These women were already vulnerable, and then to be hunted like animals.
It's just horrifying. And I keep thinking about the trauma, not just for the victims, but for their families, too.
Absolutely. The ripple effects of these crimes are immense.
And to make matters even worse, Hansen kept trophies from his victims, jewelry, clothing.
It's the kind of detail that sends shivers down your spine. Just a chilling reminder of how depraved these acts were.
And remember those reports of women disappearing after getting into cars with men who offered them money? It turns out that was Hansen's MO.
He'd prey on their desperation, their need for money, and lure them into this horrifying situation.
It's a stark reminder of the systemic issues that made these women so vulnerable.
Right. Poverty, lack of support, societal biases. It all created an environment where someone like Hansen could operate.
So as the investigation continued, did the police start to zero in on Hansen?
They did. They found eyewitness accounts of his plane near where bodies were discovered, ballistics matches to his rifle, even maps with X's marking the locations of victims' graves.
Wow.
It was a mountain of evidence.
So they finally had their guy.
Yeah, in October of 1983, Robert Hansen was arrested and charged with multiple counts of murder.
What was his reaction?
Well, he denied everything at first, tried to paint himself as an innocent victim.
Which is pretty typical for serial killers, isn't it?
It is a way to distance themselves from the reality of their crimes.
But in Hansen's case, the evidence was just too strong.
Right. And faced with the prospect of life in prison, he eventually agreed to a plea deal.
So he confessed.
He did. He confessed to the murders of 17 women, and he led investigators to the graves of many of his victims.
That's a lot of lives lost.
It is. It was a stunning admission of guilt from a man who had terrorized Anchorage for over a decade.
And did he show any remorse?
That's the disturbing part. From the sources, it seems like he didn't really. He almost seemed to relish in the details of his killings, bragging about how he outwitted and overpowered his victims.
It's hard to comprehend that level of cruelty.
It is. It's a reminder that evil can hide in plain sight, even in someone who seems to have it all. A family, a business, the respect of their community
But behind that facade,
was a monster capable of unspeakable acts.
it's just mind-boggling to think about Hansen leading this double life, hiding this darkness from everyone who thought they knew him. And even with his confession, there are still so many unanswered questions.
Absolutely.
How many more victims might be out there?
Yeah. The Alaskan wilderness is vast. It's very possible that some of Hansen's victims are buried in places that haven't been discovered yet.
That's a haunting thought. And it brings us back to those sources that focus on the victims themselves. We learn their names, their stories, their dreams. It's so easy to get caught up in the investigation, the psychology of the killer, the forensics. But we can't forget that these were real people with families and loved ones who are still grieving their loss.
That's so important to remember, the human cost of these crimes.
I mean, think about Roxanne Alon. She went on a date and never came home.
Or Lisa Frell. She carried a pistol for protection but still disappeared.
Each of these names represents a tragedy, a life cut short.
And for those who survived, like Gemma Gibbs, the guilt and the what-ifs can be overwhelming.
Yeah. She always wondered if she could have done more to prevent Beth Van Zanten's death.
It's a burden that many survivors carry.
It makes you realize that justice isn't always black and white. Even with a conviction like in Hansen's case, there are still unanswered questions, lingering pain, and a sense that true closure might never be possible.
That's true. But even in the face of such darkness, there's still hope.
What do you mean?
Well, the fact that Hansen was caught, that his crimes were exposed, that the families of his victims received some measure of justice, that's something to hold on to.
And some of the sources really highlight the efforts to create memorials for the victims, to keep their memories alive, to advocate for changes that might prevent these kinds of tragedies from happening again.
It's a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, the determination to find meaning and purpose, even in the face of unimaginable loss.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into this case, what are some of the key takeaways that stand out to you?
For me, it's a stark reminder that evil can exist anywhere, even in places that seem safe and familiar. It's a reminder to trust our instincts to be vigilant and to speak out when we see something that's not right.
And it's also a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there's still hope for justice, hope for healing, and hope for a future where these kinds of crimes become a distant memory.
I think that's a powerful message. And as you continue to think about this case, I'd encourage you to consider those systemic issues that allowed Hansen to operate for so long.
Like what?
Well, for example, the way law enforcement often dismissed missing persons cases, especially those involving sex workers,
Right.
and the societal biases that made it easier for a predator like Hansen to target vulnerable women.
These are issues that we as a society are still grappling with.
It's a sobering thought, but by understanding the past, by learning from these tragedies, we can work towards creating a better future.
A future where all lives are valued and where justice prevails.
Exactly.
Well said. And on that note, we're going to wrap up this deep dive. Thank you all for listening.